this presentation. Can you guys all see that? Yes? Okay. All right. It's kind of, I'll try to make it like as painless as possible for you guys today, but it's always kind of painful. Okay. So protists, does anyone know what protists are? Just like offhand? And you guys can see this, right? You're not looking at me, you're looking at the presentation, right? Does anyone know what protists are? No? Okay. All right. So protists are like sort of the next level up from bacteria, right? Are they in the same domain or not? What domain are bacteria
in? Don't they have like their own domain?
Exactly. Good. So bacteria are in the domain bacteria, right? And protists are in which domain then?
Eukaryotes, maybe.
Eukarya. Good. So they're in the domain eukarya, and then the level of protists is a kingdom within the domain eukarya, right? So it's the domain is eukarya, the kingdom is protista, and there are 4 other kingdoms in eukarya. So there's protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. Okay, so those 4 are eukaryotic multicellular, for the most part multicellular, but then protists are the ones that are unicellular kingdom, right? Okay, so basically like the reason that animals are in the animal kingdom and the reason that like plants are in the plant kingdom is because they have a lot in common with each other, right? The reason that fungi are in the fungi kingdom is because they have a lot in common with each other, right? The reason the protists are in the same kingdom as each other is not because they have a lot in common with each other, but it's because they don't really fit into any other kingdom very neatly, right? So that's why it's kind of like, so that their nickname, they're called the junk drawer, like kingdom. So you know how like there's like all these like little like gadgets in your house, and like sometimes you'll put like things like you'll put like silverware in the silverware drawer, you'll put like, you know, whatever, like cups in like the cup drawer, but then you have all these other like random things that you just kind of like throw in this one drawer just because they don't really fit any other criteria. That's kind of like what protists are for the kingdom, like for the kingdoms, right? So here are just a few examples of how crazily diverse these protists are, right? So diatoms, this is a type of protist, right? Look at how beautiful they are. They're like, I always love looking at slides of these. And if we had been in class, you guys would have done this whole like slide research project over the course of like, you know, a few days, where you'd look at the slides and like research each of these different protists, like diverse protists. But obviously we can't do that. So anyway, these are diatoms, right? Kelp, these are also protists. Like this looks like a big like plant, doesn't it? But it's actually like a sort of like a colony of like unicellular little organisms, which makes like this is like seaweed, right? And it actually grows in these humongous forests, and they're a huge contributor to the carbon cycle, right? Because they are photosynthetic, organisms. But again, they're not plants; they're actually protists. So these are made out of protists. Brown algae, right? All algae are protists, right? So green algae, red algae, but this is just an example of one type of algae. So again, algae is like, they're single cellular organisms, but then they sort of group in these little colonies, kind of like bacteria, but then they kind of function as like a multicellular organism, right? Water mold, that's a protist. Amoebas, you guys have all probably heard of amoebas, right? You know the amoeba sisters, which are those sisters who do those like animation like for each biological concept and stuff. But then like look at the difference between like something that's green and like grows like a plant, like that looks almost like this like kelp forest, and then like this slimy like one, like gooey sort of like amorphous creature, right? So but anyway, that's just to show you like these are in the same kingdom, but they don't really have that much in common. So again, actinopods, this is just another form of like, organism, single cellular organism that is like lumped in this category. And dinoflagellates, again, look at, some of them are transparent, right? Translucent. So there's just like a vast variety. I wanted to give you guys like an idea of how diverse they are, right? All right, so they're called the junk drawer kingdom, as we said, because they're not plants, they're not animals, they're not fungi, and they're not bacteria, right? But besides that, there's no real like rhyme or reason to why they would all be classified in the same kingdom. And as we learn more about like them, we might eventually start breaking them up into separate kingdoms of their own, but who knows? So like right now, they're all grouped together, but tomorrow they might not be, right? So they're kind of like the misfits, the biological misfits, because they don't fit into any of those other categories, right? Okay, so most of them, here are some things that could justify them being together. So most of them are unicellular, right? But some are multicellular, so there are exceptions, right? Like those kelp, those are considered multicellular, okay? They are all eukaryotic. So that's one thing that definitely does unite them, because they all have, that means they all have membrane-bound organelles, right? And a nucleus, including a nucleus, right? And then in general, most of them live in moist surroundings, like where they have easy access to water. Okay, so that's like sort of some of the, the main characteristics that unite them. But besides that, like they're very, very different. Okay. All right, so we can basically classify within the protist, like the weird junk drawer mess that is the protist kingdom. You can divide them generally into 3 different types. They're the animal-like ones, right? So those are called protozoa. Zo is like the prefix or the root for animal, right? Like zoology. And proto means like early. So it's like early animal, right? Like so primitive like animal, right? Then there are like the plant-like protists, right? So algae would be one, right? What might be one feature that might make protists plant-like? What would be like one characteristic you think that would maybe classify them into the plant-like kingdom versus the animal-like? Sorry, the plant-like group as opposed to the animal-like group. What can plants do that's like a main feature of their role? Photosynthesis, exactly, right? So if the protist, like the kelp or the algae, the brown algae, or the red algae, can perform photosynthesis, then they're probably classified like plant-like, right? And then there are the fungus-like ones. So if you go back to that picture here of like this, anything with the word mold in it is typically going to be a fungus-like one, right? Okay. So there are 3 different classifications within the kingdom itself, right? So let's just go through protozoa first, right? Protozoa, so like animals, right? Remember, they're animal-like. So that means that they would not be photosynthetic. Instead, they'd be heterotrophic, which means that they need to eat their food to get their energy, right? They're often classified by like movement, right? Like, so you know how amoebas, like how they kind of like walk around with those like fake feet that they have, they like throw their cytoplasm into like the space and then they start kind of like fake walking. And other ones like swim around with like little tails, right? Like paramecium, they or like euglenias, they have like little like, tails that like are wagging them around. So like so movement is like one characteristic of plant ones, right? See the flagellum there? And this is like it looks kind of like a bacteria almost, but it has like those organelles, those defined organelles inside of it. So that's what makes it different from from a bacteria, right? So there's flagellum that helps them move through space, but there's also these things called cilia. Have you guys heard of cilia before? These are like little hairs that like kind of like wave, and then they help with movement. They also help pull food into their, some of them have like this oral groove that like, it's kind of like a mouth where they like suck in all this food and stuff. So these are 2 things that make the protozoa look seeming like animals, right? So this one moves by wagging its tail. This one moves by shaking these hairs. And then there's the other ones that I said, like amoebas, it's called cytoplasmic streaming, where they like throw their cytoplasm out into like into the air. So like not in the air, but into like the space. You see this, here's an amoeba. So it throws out its cytoplasm into this area and then kind of like walks in that way. And then the little parts, you see this little extension here, it's kind of like a foot. So that's why that's called a pseudopod, meaning like a fake foot. All right, so these are 3 examples of animal-like protists. So amoebas, paramecium, and plasmodium. And plasmodium we'll get to in a minute, but that's the thing that causes malaria. It's pretty nasty of a protist. Okay? All right, so the next one is the plant-like protists. Again, the main reason that they're classified together is because they contain chloroplasts, which assist in the function of photosynthesis, right? Which means that they're autotrophic, meaning they make their own food from sunlight, right? And some examples are like, so algae, like kelp, right? Here's like a kelp forest. This whole thing is not a plant though, right? It's hard to like kind of think that like, wow, this is all made up like these single-celled organisms. But it's, this is like an example of how large and how important this kingdom is to, to life, obviously, because they contribute a lot of the oxygen and the glucose that is required to sustain life, right? So algae, kelp, dinoflagellates are an example, zooxanthellae, and we'll talk about those in a second. Those are the types of organisms that live inside coral that actually help coral survive because they help produce the food for the coral. And then diatoms, remember these are the diatoms. Look how cool they look, right? They look like little pieces of glass and stuff. They have like silica sometimes in their solid membranes and stuff. They're really cool. Anyway, so here are the plant-like ones, okay? And then the last group was the fungus-like ones, right? So the reason that they are classified together is because they feed on decaying matter. Okay, so they're like decomposers, right? And some examples are just like slime molds or water molds, right? And again, they're not exactly fungus because usually they're very like, they need to live near like moist sort of environments, right? Okay, any questions so far? No? So you guys get the idea of like how they're classified in general, right? Okay, so again, how do we say they get their food again? So some are just straight up autotrophic, which means they make their own food. Some are heterotrophic, which means that they get their food from eating other things. But then there's a group of them that can do both. Can you guys imagine what the word would be for both being autotrophic and heterotrophic, depending on the circumstances?
Like omniotrophs, like that.
That's a good guess. It's actually that actually sounds better than what it really is. The real word is mixotrophic, which means that they just they sometimes can, they have chloroplasts and they can make their own food if they need to, but they can also feed on other things if they want to. Okay, so they're all different types. Right. Again, just like the key word for this one, like the key concept here that you should be thinking of, it's just diversity. They're like totally like a big motley crew kind of, right? How do they reproduce? So again, they can reproduce asexually by binary fission or budding, right? They can reproduce, they can reproduce by multiple fission where they like break into like a lot more than just like 2, right? They can do budding. I already mentioned budding, right? And then they can also reproduce sexually if they want to. So it's like some of them are doing binary fission, some of them reproduce sexually. They produce gametes, which means that they would have to undergo what process in order to produce gametes? To make gametes, what process do you undergo? Meiosis, right? And they can also reproduce sexually through conjugation, kind of like, do you guys remember what conjugation is? Conjugation. Who does conjugation? Do you guys remember?
Bacteria?
Exactly, bacteria. It's just like when 2 single-celled organisms sort of like make a tunnel between them and then exchange DNA, right? But usually they do sexual reproduction under unfavorable conditions, whereas like asexually they can do like anytime. But when the going gets tough, they need more like genetic variety, I guess, and so they usually do sexual reproduction. Okay. All right. Are protists harmful or helpful? So just like the question about bacteria, are they harmful or helpful? It's the same with protists, right? They're neither harmful nor helpful. They're pretty much both, right? So they're primary producers in the food chain. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Good thing.
Definitely a good thing, right? They remove carbon from the air. So global warming and like, carbon, like obviously that's a good thing, right? What about they eat harmful bacteria? These are all really good things for humans, at least, right? Symbiosis, they live in symbiosis with a lot of organisms. So they are really, really helpful. For example, I'll show you the thing about the coral, right? Which is really, really important. And so these are all good things, right? Up till here, okay? And then, but finally, they do also cause disease in some rare cases. So that's the bad thing, okay? So they're both. Can I go on? Yeah. Oh, and here's another thing. They're also involved in algal blooms. And we talked about that a little bit at the beginning of the year, but we'll talk about it again just now. And yeah, so this is a bad thing also, right? Okay. So first of all,
I have a quick question.
Yes.
On the worksheet, it says there's 3 harmful things.
Oh, it does?
Yeah.
Maybe you could separate them into 2 different diseases that they're harmful in.
Okay.
And we'll get into that later. I don't know why there are 3. Let me think about that a little bit. But I think if not, then just separate it into 2 different diseases that they could cause. Right? Okay, so coral, what kind of organism is coral? Do you guys know? Is it a plant? Is it an animal? Is it a
protist?
Nice guess, but actually no. A coral is an animal, and then but inside of it, and so here's the anatomy of a coral, right? Here's like its body, right? It's a very primitive animal, kind of like a sponge. You guys know what sponges are, right? But it's like, it has this whole kind of weird body. This is its body, right? And then it has this like hollow cavity inside, and this is like its primitive mouth. But then it has these like tentacles, right? And if you zoom in on one of the tentacles, like one of the linings of the tentacles, do you see how they zoomed in here, right? Here are the cells of the coral, right? These little squares here. Those are the cells of the coral itself. But do you see those little dots inside of the coral? Inside of the coral cells? Those are protists. And the protists actually like live inside the animals, the coral's body. And they're the ones that actually give the coral its color. Otherwise, the coral itself would be like clear or like white. It doesn't really have a color. But these are the things that make coral so beautiful. Like when people go on coral reefs and stuff, it's like really, really, like vivid, and like people, scuba dive and like snorkel and stuff. So anyway, so there's this symbiotic relationship, and it's a symbiotic, and it's a mutualistic relationship because the coral gets like food, basically, because these protists are photosynthetic and they make sugar. So then the sugar, then the protists can use them. And then the zooxanthellae, or the dinoflagellates that live inside of the coral, also get a home and protection from the outside, like rough world, right? So it's a mutualistic relationship. Okay. Coral gets food from the protist, which photosynthesizes the food. And then the protist gets a home. Right? Easy? And then I want you to watch this video real quick, but remember the coral color is the result of the protist, not the result of the coral, right? Because the coral itself is like kind of like a clear color. I want you to watch this. I think this is really interesting. And let me know if you can't see it. Can you hear it? Yeah?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, good, thank you.
Corals are small animals, but they build structures that you can actually see from space. As we zoom in, we see the reefs where I work, a little island called Ofu in American Samoa. The ridge there, the edge, is the coral reef. And as we zoom in, we see what those reefs are. Now, the reefs are made of individual coral colonies, like we see now. That coral then is actually made up of a whole series of small polyps, they're called. This is a colonial organism. And the polyps themselves have all the structures that an animal needs. It has a mouth, it has tentacles, it has gonads, it can live, it can reproduce, it can grow. They're in a colony of genetically identical polyps. Now, the color on these tentacles, like I said, is not the color of the coral itself. It's the color of the symbiont. And as the focus racks in and out a little bit here, then what we see is that we can just see the little globules of the symbiont. Well, let's take a closer look. We'll go into a tentacle and see those. These cells, the symbionts, are not just floating around. They're actually inside the coral cells. Corals are simple. They just have two cell layers, an epidermis and a gastrodermis inside. The symbionts are inside the gastrodermis, and you can see it there. Now, this is a life form called a dinoflagellate. It has chloroplasts because it's photosynthetic, but it has very odd-shaped chloroplasts, like these yellow structures here. We're going to zoom into the chloroplast itself because that's where the damage happens during bleaching. What do chloroplasts have in them? They have membranes called thylakoid membranes. Those membranes hold the proteins called the photosystems that then capture light energy and turn it into chemical energy. It's the molecules that turn all of the sunlight that we get on the planet into the food that we eat. The rain of photons down here hits these photosystems and they gather them up. Now, if the temperature goes up and if the light goes up, then they freak out. There's too much energy. The photosystems break and they no longer can function the way they do. But the rain of photon keeps going. The energy is still there. And as a consequence, that energy is now turned into reactive oxygen molecules. Those are damaging to cells. So it damages the inside of the symbiont. It damages the inside of the coral cell and they spit the symbiont out. That spitting of the symbiont out by one coral cell isn't bad, but if the entire colony does it, then that's coral bleaching. What you can see here is simulated of the spitting out of these symbionts and the gradual whitening of this particular part of this particular coral colony. Well, when that happens across an entire colony, then the coral turns from its normal tan color into a white color. What difference does that make? The symbiont provides 75 to 80% of the energy the coral needs to survive, and without that energy, it can't make a skeleton and it can't live very long. So as a consequence, a lot of the corals that bleach eventually die.
Oops. Okay. So do you guys get the idea? So what's the whole, what were those things on the surface of the coral cells called again? I mean, sorry, not on the coral cells, on the surface, on the symbiont, on the Protists cells.
Photosystems?
Photosystem. What's a photosystem? What kind of biomolecule is that? I think they said it.
Protein.
It's a protein, right? What happens when proteins get heated above a certain temperature that they don't want to be at?
They denature.
Exactly. And so when they're denatured, what happens to their function? It goes away, right? They can't function because because they're denaturing. Exactly. So that's the whole idea. So like those photosystems, which are usually responsible, and you guys will talk a lot about those. Remember the word photosystem, because photosystem is a protein that traps the light from the sun and then processes it through the membrane to make the products that it needs to like undergo photosynthesis, right? But if the photosystems aren't working, then obviously like photosynthesis can't occur. And also it's damaging because the light is still coming in. So it damages and like throws the whole cell, the coral cell and the symbiont, the protist cell, into like, you know, like havoc, right? So then the coral ejects the symbiont, right? And that's what happens. That's why the color gets so. So yeah, so warmer temperatures. So this is just a review of that what they just said. Warmer temperatures cause the sun trapping protein to malfunction, right? Because it gets denatured. Okay, stop. Then sorry, my husband is coming in and trying to tell me something. Okay, so then all the excess energy that is no longer being processed by that photosystem then gets, you know, like causes the whole like system to malfunction. So then this is like, you know, obviously I think it's an enhanced picture, but like look at the difference between like a very healthy coral reef, get out of here, and then a very healthy coral reef, and then like a bleached one, right? Do you see the difference? It's really kind of sad. And I think, yeah, again, these are like sort of manufactured images, but you get the idea, right? All right. So that's one problem that's happening that's involving coral nowadays, right? Sorry, hold on one second. Can you, 용석, 아니, 나 지금 수업 중이야. 아니, 용석, 지금 수업 중이라고. Okay, next. So the next thing is malaria. Have you guys heard of malaria before? I'm sure you have, right?
Yes.
Okay, so malaria is a very problematic and disease. And do you guys know what malaria is spread by? Anyone?
Mosquitoes.
Mosquitoes, exactly. So a lot of people think like, oh, malaria is caused by mosquitoes, but actually the mosquitoes are not causing it. They're only the vector. Vector, again, do you guys remember what a vector is?
It's a living thing that transmits like the virus of the disease.
Exactly. So it's a living thing that transmits a disease, right? As opposed to a fomite, which is a non-living thing that can, a surface or something that can, have a disease or whatever, right? So, okay. So basically, malaria is caused by this protist, and it's called Plasmodium. Plasmodium is an animal-like protist. Okay. And the life cycle is kind of crazy. I'll show you a video, and it's kind of disturbing. I'm not gonna, I'm gonna warn you, it's pretty disturbing. But so what happens is it starts in this pregnant female mosquito. The reason is, and they'll tell you, but like pregnant mosquitoes, as opposed to like non-pregnant ones or male mosquitoes, they like seek out human blood. I don't know. They're very hungry. They want to feed their growing child or whatever. So children. That's the host or the vector, right? But the humans are also the host, right? So in this case, the female mosquito is also like the host. Like they also get the disease. They also get malaria kind of too. It's processed in a totally different way in a mosquito, obviously, but they're also like biologically, like they're not just carrying it, like kind of like giving it a physical means to travel, but they're actually getting infected by it as well, right? So let's just watch this real quick, and it's really, again, yeah, you have a light stomach.
Do you love boating? Well, Freedom Boat Club makes boating easier than ever.
The malaria life cycle follows a devious path, swapping back and forth between mosquitoes and humans. This mosquito is infected with the malaria parasite. Because she is pregnant, she has become hungry for human blood. During the bite, she injects saliva to stop the blood from
clotting.
Her infected saliva also carries the malaria parasite. The parasite rides the bloodstream like a network of roads, seeking its first target, the core of your body's blood system, the liver. Sensing its arrival at the liver, the parasite searches for an exit. A sentinel Kupfer cell is the entry point to liver tissue. Leaving the blood, the parasite infects a liver cell, killing one or more other cells on its way. Over the next few days, the parasite undergoes hundreds of nuclear divisions, copying its DNA over and over again. A single infected liver cell can create thousands of new parasites. The next generation of parasites are modified to infect a new target: red blood cells. Inside a red blood cell, the parasite can hide from the body's immune system. The parasite slowly devours the contents of the infected cell and creates more parasites. The infected cell will be sticky and gets onto blood vessel walls. Once mature, the infected cell bursts, spreading more parasites through the bloodstream. Malaria victims suffer fever, loss of blood, convulsions, brain dam, and coma. This year, 10% of people on Earth will be struck dead with malaria. Countless millions have been killed by it. Most people who die from the disease are pregnant women and children under the age of 5.
So this is the second part. So like that was when the mosquito had malaria to begin with and it infected the host. But this is when the host, this is how a mosquito originally even gets malaria from a host or from a human, right? So this is like the other side of the cycle.
Mosquitoes are usually vegetarian, preferring to drink nectar, fruit juice, and honeydew. Only a pregnant mosquito will bite humans, seeking nutrients from blood to nourish her developing eggs. If she drinks blood from someone infected with malaria, she too becomes infected with the disease. The tiny drop of blood filling the insect's stomach is teeming with malaria parasites. The parasite form that is deadly inside humans cannot survive a mosquito's stomach and is slowly digested with the rest of her blood meal. However, back in the human host, a few of the parasites turned into a different type of cell, one that is sexual but remains dormant. Malaria sex is triggered when the warm human blood begins to cool inside the insect's stomach. The female form of the parasite matures into an egg. The male form takes a while longer to mature into sperm. This sperm is from an earlier feed. The fly's cell can glide and begins to explore its new environment. It migrates to the outer lining of the mosquito's stomach before transforming into a cyst. Each cyst produces thousands of thin, tiny parasites which seek out and infest the mosquito's salivary glands. The next time this mosquito bites a victim, the malaria parasite will ride in with her saliva and infect another human. This year, 10% of people on Earth will be struck down with malaria.
Okay, so do you guys get the idea? It's kind of confusing, so I just want to go over it one more time. So basically there are two different parts. One that happens, this is inside the mosquito itself, and then one part that happens within the human itself, right? So remember, this is where it started, the video, right? The mosquito that's already infected, bites the human, and it goes to the bloodstream to the liver, and then it explodes. In that liver cell, it reproduces, but it creates a different. It creates a different type of cell, not the same cell that infected the liver originally. All right. So, and then that cell goes. Those little cells then go and attack the red blood cells, and then those also it creates a new cell when it reproduces inside of those. And then when a new mosquito that maybe wasn't infected with malaria bites the human and draws out that infected blood, then within the mosquito is when those gametes form. So they unite to form an egg and a sperm, and that's where fertilization occurs, within the mosquito, not within the human, right? So there are all these different stages of the life of the malaria parasite. You don't really have to know all those different, the names or anything, but you have to know that the fertilization occurs and the zygote is formed inside the mosquito, and then meiosis also occurs within the mosquito, right? But all these other times, it's just all mitosis. It's going from regular, from the same number to the same number. But here is where the number gets halved, right? And then here is also where the number gets doubled so these two, the gametes are single N, and then they unite in fertilization to form the 2N, which then undergoes meiosis to form the N again, okay? So just know where the fertilization and the meiosis occurs. That happens inside the mosquito, and know which cells the malaria parasite affects inside the human. It's the liver cells and then the red blood cells, right? Okay, so they have both diploid, but the diploid stage is only here, right, in the mosquito, and then everything else is haploid, right? Okay, and fertilization is in the mosquito. Okay, the answer is in the mosquito. Okay. So malaria, what were the symptoms of malaria again? Can you guys just tell me some of them that they said?
Fever, blood loss.
Fever, blood loss, convulsions, coma, even in really, really serious cases, right? Who is usually affected or most likely to die from it? Who are the populations at risk the most?
Pregnant women and children under 5, I think.
Yes, exactly. Good. All right. So pretty horrible, right? There are malaria drugs you can take. And remember, what did we say about places, people with certain genotypes for sickle cell? Do you guys remember that? They are less susceptible to malaria because some of their blood cells are sickle shaped, right? So that was also something that we had talked about in terms of malaria. All right, and then this is the last thing. No, I have 2 more things to talk about, actually. All right, so African sleeping sickness, this is another one. And if you guys do the diseases, you guys could choose this disease as one of them. It's just another disease that's caused by a protist. So this protist is called trypanosoma. What was the other one? What was malaria caused by again? What protist was it caused by?
Plasmodium.
Plasmodium, good. And what was the vector for malaria?
Mosquito.
Mosquito, okay. So for the vector for African sleeping sickness is this African tsetse fly. So it's not a mosquito, it's a tsetse fly, and that's what it looks like, right? And basically what it does is, so when the trypanosoma vector, or not, sorry, when the trypanosoma protist gets into your body, it causes all these neurological problems like headache, fever, joint pain, itching. And one of the main reasons it's called sleeping sickness is that it disrupts your sleeping patterns, and it makes you kind of like all confused and all like, disoriented, uncoordinated. So this is another type of disease that can be caused by a protist, right? Here's a picture, I think, do I have a picture of people affected by it? And it looks kind of like this. This is trypanosoma, and it changes its surface protein a lot so that the immune system, remember we talked about how immune systems start recognizing certain specific proteins or antigens on the surfaces of invaders, but it can change its surface proteins, which can help it avoid the immune system and then keep attacking you. Okay? All right. All right. This is just a diagram of what happens. And again, it happens both here in the human and here in the bug itself. You don't need to know this. This is just to keep, to keep aware that it happens here and then it happens here in the human and then in the bug. Okay? And then this is another a protist that causes a disease in history. You guys have heard of the Irish potato famine, right? Some people will say that it was caused by a fungus, but it was actually classified as a fungus at that time. But since they've changed the classification of this thing to a fungus-like protist, right? So it was caused by this thing called Phytophthora infestans, which is a water mold, kind of like a fungus, but not a fungus. And basically it causes this disease called potato late blight, and everything just becomes this like gooey black mush. And so in Ireland at that time, their main staple crop was the potato. So like 1 million people died from starvation because they couldn't eat this, gross, or if they did, it made them sick. And then millions of people also emigrated from the country at that time because there was nothing to eat, right? So it was a really difficult time in history, all thanks to a protist. Right? So protists can certainly be helpful, but they can also have like disastrous effects on crops or on our own health, right? So just, it's like always like a double, all these organisms like bacteria and, they all have sort of like good sides and bad sides, right? And then the last thing is an algal bloom. And we talked about this, so I don't want to like go too much in detail about it. But do you guys remember what an algal bloom was or what caused it?
Wasn't it like excess nutrients in like water, normally caused by like fertilizers, and then caused like a sudden growth of algae, which basically kills off the whole ecosystem within that body of water.
Exactly, good, because suddenly the algae, like we're putting the fertilizer to feed our plants and our grass and stuff like that, right? But when it runs off, algae also like that food, right? So they just like start like binge eating like all the extra fertilizer, all the extra runoff, and then they start overtaking the ecosystem. They start blocking, an excess amount of growth from algae can block, other organisms from getting the proper sunlight or oxygen that they need, right? And they can also release toxins, right? That, like waste, right? Extra, because all organisms, they take in things, but then they excrete wastes, right? And like if that waste is toxic, then that whole organism, all the organisms in that area could suffer. So excess nutrients in the soil from fertilizers that we're overusing fertilizers run off and then cause way too much algae. and then they release the toxins and they deplete oxygen, and it looks like this, right? So like this is like a red algal bloom, right? And then here's an example of like a regular, green algal bloom. And yeah, it's called eutrophication, when you have too much nutrients, so that you'll end up, causing this like burst of algae, right? And then that results in fish kills and human health risks, right? You guys can watch this video on your own if you want, but I'm not gonna, I don't think I'm gonna play it. Did I answer all the questions on the worksheet, or, yeah? No? Yes? Like watching Lito's fish, like going here. All right, no one has any comments or questions? No? All right, I'll post the PowerPoint, and then I will see you guys. Oh, I'm gonna post the question too. Please answer the question, or the one about like whether you want, so it would be like whether you would want to do a presentation, and whether you want, if you do choose the presentation, whether you want to do it in groups or not. So there'll be 2 votes: presentation, if it is a presentation, in groups or not. And then the other question will be presentation versus 2 quizzes. Okay? Yeah. And they'd probably be worth like about the same amount of points. So, if a quiz would have been like 50, 60 points, then the presentation would be like 100 points, right? Or 120 or whatever. Yeah. I think the presentation would be about 100, and then the 2 quizzes would be like 50-50. Okay? All right. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Have a good day. All right? Okay. Bye.
Have a good one.
Okay, thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.